Hi, we're female students from Leicestershire, and we're currently running a project to encourage more women and people from gender minorities to get into STEM subjects. And today we're interviewing Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who's a very influential astrophysicist. So, Jocelyn, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Let's talk about your part in the discovery of pulsars in 1967. How did that come about?
I was a graduate student in Cambridge. I had done a bachelor's degree in physics in Glasgow and studying for what's called a PhD, which would give me the title of doctor. It's a 3-year project, basically, and your project report is a whole book. And I was 2.5 years into the project. So the end is in sight, or at least the end of my funding is in sight. And I'm being very, very careful because I was suffering from what we now would call imposter syndrome. And because I was being very careful, I noticed a curious additional signal over and above what I was expecting to see. And after a lot of effort, it turned out to be this signal that went blip, 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 blip every 1 1/3 seconds, which turned out to be what we now call a pulsar.
You said you were suffering from imposter syndrome. What did you mean by that?
Right. Imposter syndrome is where somebody starts a new job or something like that and realizes that everybody else there is extremely clever and feels that they are not, that somehow or other they've got in by mistake. Somebody has made a mistake recruiting them and they feel an imposter, hence the name imposter syndrome. We didn't have a name for it back then, but we do name it now. And since I work in Oxford University, that's the kind of place where people can suffer imposter syndrome. So somebody comes to Oxford, maybe they're the first student from their school to get into Oxford. They do not come from a public school, they do not have rich parents, and they think, oh, I'm different to everybody else here. They've made a mistake admitting me, etc., etc.
I know that you're now very influential and you've kind of discovered these signals. Did your imposter syndrome stick around after that, or?
All right. I think imposter syndrome is probably something that's liable to hit you each time you change job, for instance, go to a new place. Or it can do, particularly if you're in a minority, which you've probably noticed women in physics are still a minority. So I think it particularly can affect minority groups. But making that discovery certainly helped my self-confidence. Yeah, that's for sure.
I've heard something about when you first discovered that signal, you thought it could be an alien signal. Is that true?
Radio astronomers are aware that they are the people who are perhaps most likely to pick up signals from extraterrestrials, nicknamed little green men. I did not seriously believe this was little green men, and when I found a second, a third, and a fourth source of them, I was quite clear it was not little green men. But as a bit of a joke, I had labelled the first one Little Green Men, and the name stuck.
So for that discovery in 2018, you won the Special Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics. Can you tell us a bit about that and maybe your experience of being a female scientist in the public eye?
So the Breakthrough Prize is deliberately set up to be like the Oscars for science. So the ceremony is like the Oscars. You know, there's the red carpet, there's a whole barrage of photographers and lights flashing and all this kind of thing. And sort of stirring music between the announcements and all that kind of thing. So it's a bit film star-ish. And it's deliberately meant to help science get the same kind of profile as film stars get. It was certainly unlike anything I'd been at before. And it has this enormous sum of money attached, $3 million, which translates to being about 2.3 million pounds. So it's an awful lot of money. And frankly, more than I wanted to have to handle, and certainly a lot more than I needed. So I gave the money away to the Institute of Physics, which is the professional body for physicists in the UK and Ireland. And they had a number, well, still have a number of initiatives to increase diversity in physics. Physics in the British Isles is predominantly white men, and they're trying to increase the number of people of colour, the number of women, the number of disabled, etc., etc. And so they were very happy to have this money because I wanted them to use it to increase diversity in physics. So that's how it's being used.
Wow, that's really good.
And how do you feel looking back over your career as a woman in STEM?
My career, in inverted commas, has not actually been a normal career. For a good many years, I was married and we were moving about the country for my husband's job. And there also was a child who now is a physicist. Surprise, surprise. He's in the University of Leeds. So my career was really a succession of jobs. It was hugely interesting, hugely variable. Sometimes the jobs were of very lowly status because that was the only job I could get in that place at that time. And sometimes they were quite prestigious, but it's been hugely varied. And you'll be familiar with the electromagnetic spectrum, you know, radio waves, infrared, visible, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. If you have a picture of that in your mind, I started in radio astronomy. I then jumped to the other end of the spectrum and did some gamma ray astronomy. I then moved a little bit closer to radio again and did X-ray astronomy. I then moved a bit closer to radio again and did infrared astronomy and millimeter wave astronomy. So I covered most of the electromagnetic spectrum, all the time as an astronomer making observations. It's not a normal career, but it's been huge fun.
And is there a particular part that was you particularly enjoyed over the other ones?
Yes, I was particularly lucky with X-ray astronomy. The X-rays don't get through the Earth's atmosphere. So if you're going to study stars and galaxies in X-rays, you need to get your equipment above the Earth's atmosphere. And we launched a satellite. This was about 1974, something, no, later than that. But anyway, 1980 maybe. My son was in primary school. I remember that. And I was in charge of this satellite for the lab where I worked. And it was my job to make sure the satellite was working properly, that it was set up to make the observations we wanted it to make. And when the data came in, that the observations were indeed the observations we were expecting. And they weren't always the observations we were expecting, because lo and behold, a strange new source of X-rays had flared up when we were looking at that bit of sky. We call this a transient source. It comes and it goes. And that satellite discovered transient source after transient source after transient source, usually on a Friday afternoon, just when you're trying to get wrapped up for the weekend. And I had to run around and find somebody, a student or some other scientist, to take charge of this data showing this new unexpected transient and to get moving on it fast so that we could put out an announcement to the rest of the community that there's a new transient source at this particular position in the sky. It was hugely exciting and manic and crazy.
What advice would you give women and minority groups if for studying physics and other STEM subjects?
I would say go for it. If you're interested in the subject, if you reckon it's one of your strengths, please go for it. Physics is getting more diverse. The minorities are not as small as they used to be. There's big effort now to get more women and minority groups into physics. And I think that's going to strengthen physics. It's been shown by some business consultants that the most successful and the most flexible businesses are the ones with the most diverse workforce. I'm sure the same thing applies in physics. So do please go into physics, improve the diversity, have fun, and be very successful.
Okay, thanks, Jocelyn. That was really good.
Thank you very much for your time and for being such an inspiration to young women in the physics community. And thank you, girls, as well, for putting yourselves out there to try and organise something to support other students at our college with their dreams and ambitions of becoming physicists. So thank you.
And thank you for some very good questions too. Thank you very much for your work.